a bit of time this year so far to take stock of where we're at currently and consider the events of the world. It's time. And I've been sort of personally following current events closely for a while now, and I remember saying to Carrie at the very start of this year that I really feel like Christ is on the doorstep. So there is on the doorstep. There are so many events that are happening at the moment that are just converging all at once, just like we've never seen before in the history of modern Christadelphia. And in 1948 and 1967, as a brotherhood, we were ecstatic. Finally, the Jews had returned to Israel, their land, just as Ezekiel had prophesied. No more, no less. And if we go back further to post-World War in 1919, as a brotherhood, we saw the Ottoman Empire pushed up back into Turkey, and that was the beginning of the drying of the Euphrates, just as Revelation had prophesied. No more, no less. And again, as a brotherhood at that point in time, we were on the edge of our seats. Obviously, most of us weren't there, but you only need to read the Christadelphian literature that was out at that time just to get a palpable sense of just what it was like. And here we are in 2015, brothers and sisters, and we're seeing the convergence of these events that we're going to look at tonight. Well, in Revelation chapter 3, which is the chapter that Uncle Brian just read, we heard the words of Christ to the ecclesia, and words that we would never want to hear ourselves from Christ. And the reason that I picked that chapter is because I very much agree with the suggestion of Brother Thomas, who says that the ecclesia of Laodicea here in Revelation is not just talking about the ecclesia of that time, but it's also talking about the ecclesia in the last days. And there's a few reasons for that. But one of them is that near the end of this letter, Christ says, "Behold, I stand on the door and knock." And so as we consider these current events tonight, there's two questions that we should have at the back of our mind. The first, when is Christ coming? And the second and most important, am I ready? Well, as tonight we'll spend much of our time watching for the return of Christ, considering the signs of the times in the lead up to the event of Christ's return. But as we do this, we also need to consider, are we ready mentally? Are we ready spiritually? And over the last few months, you would have heard that there's been a great deal of talk around Greece. And you might have heard that Greece has been constantly bailed out by the International Monetary Foundation over the past 5 years. And up until now, the Eurozone members have been trying to enforce quite harsh austerity measures to ensure that Greece makes good on its payments. And of course, until recently, when the Greek people voted in a left-wing government to try and stop that austerity. But the problem, of course, here is paradoxical, because Greece has to pay its debt or it leaves the euro. And from the creditor's perspective, it's either one or the other. But the Greek people want both. And so Tsipras, the Greek Prime Minister, has called a referendum as of, I think, yesterday, just to decide whether or not Greece should meet its creditors' terms, and he calls that blackmail. But the intriguing thing about all of this is that the group who gave Greece this money in the first place, the IMF, the director of the IMF came out this morning and said that the referendum relates to proposals and arrangements with the IMF that are no longer valid. And so whichever way the Greeks decide to go on this, it's very unlikely, whichever way they vote, that they will be able to pay back the IMF before the deadline of July the 5th. And so we won't spend much time tonight talking about Greece, because prophetically speaking, there isn't too much relevant about it, other than the situation itself is likely to bring about a significant change in Europe going forwards. And one which sees perhaps the European Union back into a group of 10 nations. And that is the 10 nations that we find, which are the 10 toes of Nebuchadnezzar's image in Daniel chapter 10. And so perhaps the bigger question for all of us here tonight is, how long do we have? How soon is Christ's return? And as a community, we've been asking this question since the mid-1800s. And since that time, some of us have lost our faith. And to those of us who have been in that situation, the hope of Christ's return has become nothing more than a false vision. But now it's 2015. Tens of thousands of Christadelphians have passed away, having lived much of their lives in the hope of Christ's soon return. And we might wonder, will the same thing happen to us? Will we live out the rest of our lives in the hope of our Lord's sure return, only to pass away? Well, before we make that determination, let's just spend a quick few minutes summarising status quo at the moment and in terms of prophecy and current events. And to start with, I've picked a few prophecies which we'll cover briefly just to begin with to get an idea of where we're at now. And in context, these prophecies are expected to occur just before or after the return of Christ. And so as we consider these now, we know that Christ is really on the doorstep. So let's start with Russia. And we could spend a whole night on Russia, but we're only going to cherry pick one aspect, and that is the rearmament of Russia before it invades the south. And for those of us who aren't familiar with Ezekiel 38, Ezekiel 38 is talking of a time when the biblical Gog, who we believe is Russia, will invade Turkey and Egypt and ultimately Israel with a mighty military, perhaps around the same time or before the return of Jesus Christ to the earth. And so just to illustrate this point, 1989 saw a time of positive relations with the West. We saw disarmament, and approximately 25 years later, during that time, there was positive daytime with the West, and 25 years later, we now see Russia removing any of its rearmament treaties that it had in place and rearming quite quickly, which is also sending Putin's political popularity sky high. Now, just remember, when we look at this, we're not even going to talk about Russia's invasion of Georgia in 2008. We're not even going to talk about Russia's invasion of Crimea last year. In 2014. That was more than a year ago now. We only need to look at the past 2 months to get an idea of how fast and how quickly Russia is rearming and becoming aggressive, militarily speaking. And so we start here with a report that's based on Russia's finance report, which was released in April this year, entitled Russian Economist, the Kremlin's military spending binge is completely unsustainable. And one of the things that they mention is that Russia is spending more on its military than it can afford to, that its military expenditure was more than double the budgeted amount. And they're saying that at this rate, its reserve fund will be emptied before the end of the year. And so we can see there's an enormous explosion of growth in Russia's military, and clearly it has the West worried. Well, last year we also saw the pro-Russian separatist invasion of Ukraine, which is still happening now, but it wasn't until this year that President Poroshenko, the president of Ukraine, warned his parliament of a full-scale Russian invasion. And of course, President Poroshenko isn't the only one. There's many other states in that region who have been quite worried that Russia is planning a full-scale invasion of some kind. As we say, Ukraine is not the only one, there's Finland as well. So Finland, for example, which sits on the border of Russia, they put on notice very recently, a couple of months ago, nearly 1 million military reservists in that region for the first time in many years. It was reported a few weeks back that Russia's military is to have a 50% increase in intensive training over the course of this coming summer, which is their July to November. And the report says here that the timing coincides with Ukrainian reports that a full-scale invasion will happen in the summer. And so the Ukrainians firmly believe that this apparent increase in military training is actually just a cover for an actual invasion. And of course, we saw that when Russia invaded Crimea. They employed the same tactics before they invaded, except of course this time it isn't Crimea, it's potentially a chunk of Europe. In March this year, it was reported that Russia is considering building a fleet of enormous heavy transport aircraft which could enable it to mount what they called a global military response. And the specs show the incredible capability of this transport carrier. But just to read a part of the article, it says, in the future, a fleet of heavy transport aircraft will be reportedly capable of moving a strategic unit of 400 armada tanks with ammunition to anywhere in the world, and probably at hypersonic speed, enabling Russia to mount a global military response. And the article actually goes on to say, it's obvious that Russia is preparing for a full-scale military confrontation of transcontinental scale. And apparently a source who attended one of the meetings that was managing this said on condition of anonymity that he was shocked by the demands of the military. And so as we read through the invasion in Daniel 11 and Ezekiel 38, we are told that the invasion will be sudden and overpowering. Ezekiel 38 says it will be like a storm, and Daniel 11 says it will be like a whirlwind. And that is what we would expect. That's the kind of military hardware we would expect to see from Russia. So just to quickly summarise on that, in 1989 we saw just at the end of the Cold War, we began to see a time of positive relations with the West start, and for the next 25 years they had a pretty good run with America and the West. And then finally at the very beginning of this year they've really started to ramp up their anti-Western rhetoric against NATO and the US and Europe. Well, let's move to a different part of Ezekiel 38, and that is in Israel. And in Ezekiel 38, it says of Israel that they will dwell in safety, all of them. Well, in 1967, some of us would remember Israel when it was facing extinction, when 5 much larger Arab nations converged on Israel to annihilate it. And in only what could have been through the hand of God, Israel was able to neutralise those armies. But it hasn't really been until 2015 that Israel has gained the perception of safety. Only a month ago, the chief of the Israeli Defence Force said that Israel's security situation has never been better. And whether, of course, you believe that this peace comes about through an agreement with the latter day of Syria, it's still intriguing to see this very recent perception of security and safety come upon the land of Israel. And so we see Israel in a state that is very close to what we would expect around the time of the invasion of Gog. Well, another prophecy that we have is the prophecy of Egypt, and this is not in Ezekiel 38, this is taken from Isaiah 19. But going back to 2011, some of us might remember the political unsettling that we had in Egypt. And that started with Prime Minister Mubarak's resignation, and from that point on there was utter chaos in the streets. After Mubarak, Mohammed Morsi from the Muslim Brotherhood was elected as Prime Minister, and just a year later mass riots broke out in the streets, and eventually Mohammed Morsi was ousted by the military leader El-Sisi, who generously made himself Prime Minister. And if you just turn with me to Isaiah chapter 19, we'll have a look at this in a bit more detail. And so Isaiah 19, verse 2 to 4, God says when he was prophesying through the prophet Isaiah to Israel, "And I will stir up Egyptians against Egyptians, and they will fight, each against another, each against his neighbour, city against city, kingdom against kingdom." And we saw that come to pass in 2011. But something a bit more intriguing about this prophecy is it heralds the return of Christ, or it's around the time of the return of Christ. So when Christ does return, what happens? Well, we know the resurrection takes place first, and then there's judgment at Sinai. And then what does Christ do? He moves into Egypt with the saints. Why? Well, if we have a look at verse 20, we have our answer. Isaiah 19, verse 20. For they, the Egyptians, shall cry unto God because of the oppressors, and he shall send them a saviour, a great one, and he shall deliver them. And we say, well, is Egypt oppressed now? Absolutely they are. And sure, it will probably become worse under Gog, but they are absolutely under military oppression now. Ever since the military took over power, the cases of human rights abuses by the military on the streets has been utterly horrifying. If you are a young woman and you care for your purity, which, by the way, is a big deal in Egypt, you will most likely be divorced or shunned if you have been abused as a woman. You avoid the military at all costs. And it has been proven by human rights organisations that this kind of perverse abuse is rampant on the streets of Egypt. And the victims are not just women, but they're also men at the hand of the military. And so just to illustrate how effective the military in Egypt is at subjugation, at the height of the protests in 2013, millions of people filled the streets in Cairo like ants, and it was dubbed the biggest protest in history. And we see there Cairo, around the centre of Cairo, in the morning of the 3rd of July. On the evening of the 3rd of July, you can see it was a very, very different picture. The centre of Cairo, well, in fact, much of Cairo was a mess of blackened, burning, twisted metal bodies and belongings. Why? The military had come through to stop it. And just a couple of months later, the military cleared more riots, and in the process, they massacred over 800 civilians. And so, brothers and sisters, we can conclude that there is currently an oppressor in Egypt now, just as Isaiah 19 said it would be. It's the military. And we can expect that at the return of Christ, or before the return of Christ, it's only going to get worse. But if we come back to Isaiah 19, we'll have a bit more of a look as to why this is happening. Because we find that God will humble them to such a low degree that they realise that they cannot be saved even by their own kind. And at that point, we will see much more of this. It isn't until they get to that point that God sends them a saviour. And who will be that saviour? Christ and his saints. And so, God willing, you and I will be the ones to walk through Egypt, to spread the sun's healing beams upon the nation, and we will respond and bring comfort and blessing to every man and woman and child who have no other way out. And finally, and just briefly, only a couple of months ago, as most of us would have heard, the Conservative Party in the United Kingdom were voted in, which ushered in the mandate for a referendum on the issue of whether or not the United Kingdom should be or stay a part of the European Union. And that, of course, the separation of the United Kingdom from Europe, is the state that we would expect to find the United Kingdom around the time of the invasion of Gog, as we find in Ezekiel 38. And so if we put them all together, we can see here that these prophecies, which are all related to the return of Christ, are beginning to come to fruition in some way or other. And doesn't that make 2015 look like a very unique year? You can see how the nations are positioning for Ezekiel 38 and Isaiah 19. And none of this was happening back in the time of Brother Thomas. In fact, most of it has really only started to happen over the last couple of years. But brothers and sisters, there is another prophecy I'd like to take a look at. Another prophecy that we can add to this list that proves that 2015 really is a unique year in terms of prophecy. And it's a prophecy that refers to a force that we've seen becoming globally infamous over the last couple of years. And that is ISIS. And you will have no doubt have heard of them in the news. The picture up on the big screen here depicts one of the most famous ISIS jihadis, a man who routinely decapitated people and then sent the videos to media outlets around the world as part of the larger ISIS strategy of terror and fear. Well, ISIS is a very unique terror organisation. Al-Qaeda, of course, were very well known for destroying the World Trade Center in September the 11th, 2001. But even Al-Qaeda haven't quite lived up to the name that ISIS have really built for themselves. And one of the first things that makes ISIS unique is that they've captured and continue to control large amounts of Syrian and Iraqi territory, all centering around the Euphrates. Al-Qaeda never did that. In fact, ISIS now controls half of Egypt and a large part of Iraq, which we'll have a closer look at in a minute. And one of the things that makes them so feared in the Middle East is the way that they treat those whom they subjugate. They're horrifyingly violent. They cause wanton devastation, and they regularly have mass executions where they purge territories of Christians, minorities, and those who have found allegiances elsewhere. They're arguably worse than the Nazi SS. They routinely pillage, rape, and abuse on an epidemic scale. And in fact, just to scratch the surface of their depravity, last year their leadership released a document saying that ISIS are legally entitled to have their own children as slaves. And it was recently reported that this systematic pedophilia is accepted under ISIS law and continues to happen on an enormous scale. Well, not only that, but the violence is barbaric. It was reported only Tuesday this week that 2 children were publicly crucified on the streets because they were caught eating on Ramadan, which is a Muslim month of fasting. And you think, how bad can it get? Well, as all of this happens within their own borders, over 60 nations are directly or indirectly waging war against ISIS, including, of course, the most powerful. According to what the United States are saying, they've so far apparently dropped around 16,000 bombs and missiles on ISIS alone. That is the US alone who have done that. But they continue to grow in number. Well, for the towns that aren't captured or controlled, they are utterly destroyed. And this is a picture of a town called Kobani, which was at the very top of Syria. And you might have heard of this town. Actually, it came up in the news this week. It's been utterly destroyed. Now, some of that is actually Allied air bombing, I think. I'm pretty sure, because I'm not sure how you could possibly do that with land forces. But anyway, so we get a sense of how advanced ISIS is. Just some quick facts. They actually control territory which is occupied by over 10 million people. We've already said that there's 60 nations directly or indirectly waging war against ISIS. ISIS makes millions of dollars a week from its captured oil fields, and it's capable of producing 500,000 barrels of oil a day. They have their own treasury department, and they have their own currency. And so they're very advanced for a terror organisation. And it's no wonder that Obama told the press recently that America is essentially lost on how they can deal with ISIS. They don't have a strategy, and it's turning into another Vietnam. Well, just to give you an idea of the territory that ISIS controls. So up here we have Syria at the top, and the capital city of Syria is Damascus in this area here. On the eastern side of the map, we've got Iraq in this section. We've got Baghdad there and Ramadi there, which is the second biggest capital of Iraq, city of Iraq. And straight down through the middle, we've got the Euphrates River. So what we've done now is just overlaid a map which shows the territory that ISIS controls. So ISIS is the grey section. It's actually quite hard to see on the screen here. But they've taken everything in this area here. So that's half of Syria, and that's a large part of Iraq. But interestingly, it all centres around the Euphrates, and they're increasingly taking control of this area too. They also have taken the second biggest capital city in Iraq. And so I've got an infographic here which was created by the New York Times, very interesting map. And what I'll do is we'll do this now. What it will do is show satellite imagery as we go down the Euphrates, just to get an idea of what it looks like and what the towns are that are there. And so we're going to start at the top. This is around the top of the Euphrates and at the top of Syria. As we go down, you'll find there's some towns here which have the label ISIS control. So you'll see most towns have that. And also at the bottom right here, there's a map which shows where we're moving as we move down the Euphrates. And so Saran under ISIS control, Mascana, ISIS control. And you'll notice also the area outside of this, which is the which is not centred in the Euphrates, is mainly desert, but there is a lot of oil fields in there that have been taken by ISIS too. And so we're just coming down to the bottom of Syria and the border of Syria and Iraq. And all of this area has been taken again by ISIS. And we're moving down into Iraq now. And Dam, they've been occasionally drying up areas of the Euphrates to try and get better access to government forces on the other side of the river. So there's Ramadi, the second biggest town or city in Iraq, as I said earlier. Government forces have been trying really hard to get that back, but they haven't been able to. Fallujah, which is the closest city next to Baghdad, ISIS have taken that as well. So ISIS actually have up here, this is Baghdad here, at the top there they've started to take that area. Down here and down on the southwestern side of Baghdad, they've actually started to take this area as well. So we can see that almost all the Euphrates, from the top of Syria down to Baghdad, ISIS has attacked and taken control of those regions. And it's primarily the civilization along the Euphrates that is at the very, very centre of ISIS control. So we can see quite clearly that the Euphrates here has been taken by ISIS from Syria and Iraq. And if you just turn back with me to Revelation chapter 16, because Revelation chapter 16 gives us some ideas as to why this is happening. And so in Revelation chapter 16 we have the outpouring of the vials of wrath or judgment, which events which have occurred largely in modern history from the time of the French Revolution. And as we might know, the fifth vial occurred around the time of Napoleon. And in verse 12 we have the sixth angel on the sixth vial, which is contemporary with our time. And if we read Revelation 16 verse 12, it says, "And the sixth angel poured out his vial upon the great river Euphrates, and the water thereof was dried up, that the way of the kings of the east might be prepared." Well, now what is this drying up? Well, it's a political drying up, as our brother Thomas showed us in Eureka. It's a political drying up which started with the pushing back of the Ottoman Empire. So at its greatest strength, the Ottoman Turkish Empire had part of Europe, part of the top of north of Africa, and particularly near the end of its control, it mainly had this section here, which was the Euphrates and Turkey, I think. But eventually 1919 saw them pushed back up into Turkey, which is where they now reside, and those areas there were given to control of states. Now, Brother Thomas prognosticated that in Eureka that the Turkish Empire would be dried up in the sense that it would lose its power in that region. He didn't actually go as far as to say that the Turks would be removed completely from the Euphrates itself, but it was certainly close enough. But to really understand the purpose behind this drying up, we need to read the rest of the verse. If we read it again, it says, "And the sixth angel poured out his vial upon the great river Euphrates, and the water thereof was dried up, that the way of the kings of the east might be prepared." And so who are the kings of the east? Well, they are the saints. And there's a number of reasons why we think that. We can't go through all of them now due to time. But I encourage you to read through the section in Eureka, Volume 5, on that topic if you haven't already. The most unique thing here is that the saints are referred to as kings. Kings of the east, or kings of the sun's rising, as Brother Thomas points out. But why kings? Because our role, the role of the saints, or the role of the kings here, will be a judicial role. And so, as we go back over the history of this land of the Euphrates, we can see the political drying up in preparation for the kings. Now, over 2,000 years ago, that area around the Euphrates and the Tigris was known as Syria, up in that section there. But just under 100 years ago, we saw this earlier, was under the control of the Ottoman Empire prior to 1919. And so what has happened since the reduction of the Ottoman Empire? Well, the region of the Euphrates was taken from the Turks and it was divided into two states, Syria and Iraq, where those states today have remained, well, as political powers in their own right until 2011, as we saw, when it was taken from them by ISIS. Well, what happened in 2011? So we've seen the two states. Well, in 2011, roughly in that time frame, we saw ISIS take control of the Euphrates from those nations. Now, of that whole timeline, where do you think the judicial intervention of the saints might be required the most? I would suggest here, where we have ISIS. And so you're beginning to see a pattern here, because didn't we just see a similar thing happen in Egypt? If you turn back with me to Isaiah chapter 19. And so I'm going to ask the question, why has this started happening? Why are these regions now under oppression from their own kind? Well, Isaiah 19 talks of the oppression of Egypt that we see today. The drying up of the Nile and the coming of Christ and the saints into Egypt. But it also talks about Assyria, the ancient Euphratean power at the time that this prophecy was made. And so Isaiah 19 talks of the smiting and the healing of Egypt. We saw that Egypt is currently suffering oppression, with perhaps worse to come under Gog. And that is spoken of in Isaiah alongside the drying up of the Nile. And later in verse 20, we saw that Christ the Saviour moves into Egypt with the saints to heal Egypt. Well, we just saw the same thing in Revelation, didn't we? We saw the drying up of the Euphrates, which started with the Turks, the Ottoman Empire, and possibly ends with ISIS. Why? To make way for the saints to come in and heal the land. And it's possible that God's plan for Egypt, which is mentioned in Isaiah chapter 19, is very, very similar for God's plan for the latter-day Assyrian, as we see in Revelation and our work today. And of course, Isaiah 19 ends up talking about blessings to both the Egyptian and the Assyrian after they have been healed. And so if you just come back with me to Revelation chapter 16, we know that we are contemporary with the time of the sixth vial. We can see the Euphrates drying up in preparation for the coming of the saints. Well, brothers and sisters, just before the seventh vial is poured out, in verse 17, Christ does something which he doesn't do for any of the previous vials. He speaks to the generation that is contemporary with the sixth vial. And he says in verse 15, "Behold, I'm coming as a thief. Blessed is he who watches and keeps his garment, lest he walk naked and they see his shame." And so, brothers and sisters, the Euphrates is at the final stages of its political drying up. It's in a state of oppression that is probably worse than Egypt at this point, and it will also only deteriorate worse as the nations are preparing for the return of Christ. And so as we read this letter from Christ, we know that Christ is alive now and that he is in our midst, and that 2,000 years ago he wrote this this and told us that this would happen as a sign of his coming. Blessed is he who watches. And so there we have it. There's only a handful of latter-day prophecies that are in the making that each eventually bring us in their own right to Christ or the invasion of Gog. So we looked at Russia just briefly. End of the Cold War in 1989, they had a positive relationship with the West until 2015. Israel, not really until 2015 that it's gained this false sense of security, perhaps. And of course in Egypt we saw the starting of the revolutions around 2011, and again perhaps around 2013, 2014, that was subjugated by the military, who now have control over Egypt. And of course United Kingdom, we've just seen the referendum come up, which is planned for 2016-2017, possibly separating the United Kingdom from the European Union, as we would expect. And then, of course, we've got the drying up of the Euphrates, which is quite similar to Egypt, where we see ISIS starting to control much of the Euphrates. For what purpose? Well, as we discussed, in preparation for the coming of the kings. Well, what more do we need, brothers and sisters? None of this happened in the time of Brother Thomas. And it wasn't until 5 years ago, at least, that most of these prophecies started to take place. In fact, most of the updates on this really came through in the last couple of months. Well, before we move on, there is another sign of Christ's coming. And this time, it isn't so much an Old Testament prophecy, which is what we've been seeing up till now, but it's more a warning from Christ of a time when general prosperity will cease to exist straight after his return. And what we're going to do now is we're just going to spend a couple of minutes looking through the articles which have been published over the last 2 months by leading journalist sources. And none of this information which I'm about to show you is taken from apocalyptic conspiracy sites. It has all been taken from the biggest and trusted names in journalism or economics, so we would expect that hopefully their information is real and verifiable. And all of them are saying one thing. They're saying that we are on the precipice of an unprecedented global financial catastrophe. And so the first article that we have here is a piece by The Economist. And what they say at the very start of this article is that when the financial crisis happened in 2008, the banks had an enormous amount of money which they could use as stimulus for the economy. And so when it came, they stimulated their economies, but of course that ran into their bank balance. So much of them were left in quite a bit of debt since that time. But of course since 2008, after having stimulated their economies, they don't have that kind of surplus in their budgets. They're very much in debt now. So if the same thing does happen, where are the banks going to be then? And they're saying that should recession strike again, as inevitably it will, rich countries in particular will be ill-equipped to fend it off. And they've got a picture there of a knight which represents the Western world, thinking that it's slain the financial crisis, when in actual fact it's walking into the mouth of a much, much bigger dragon. And so there's actually quite a few people who are well respected in finance and economics who are all saying the same thing. And incidentally, it started in April, as far as I can tell. On April the 9th, a man called Jamie Dimon, who was the CEO of JP Morgan, which is America's biggest bank, came out and said in a letter to investors in the context of a potential crisis that there will be another crisis and that the banks will be unable to effectively act due to regulations. 10 days later, April the 19th, a man called Jeffrey Gundlach, this man who predicted the subprime crisis that sparked the Great Recession, was talking of a similar thing. And he said that this year there is a risk of a run on high yield bond funds. June the 1st, a man called Nouriel Roubini, I think, this man also managed to predict the 2008 financial crisis. He's a professor of economics at the Stanford School of Business, and his comment in a fairly blunt article in The Guardian was that a liquidity time bomb will trigger a bust and a collapse, and monetary policies have created a dangerous paradox. And this man here, Steve Schwarzmanoff, also manager of a large investment firm, said that sellers will offer securities, but there will be no buyers, and he said that on June the 10th. Well, only 8 or so days ago, or less days ago, Ron Paul, former US Congressman, came out and said there's going to be a day of reckoning, and he says it's going to happen very soon. I don't think it's just going to be a correction. I think what will happen is that the efforts made in 2008, 2009 to correct all these mistakes will resume themselves. They will lose confidence, that is the market, and that is when you will see the very, very big crash. And only on Friday, 2 days ago, a man called Raghuram Rajan, which is India's Reserve Bank governor, also said that a crisis is about to hit us. This man also predicted the 2008 crisis. And in this case, he said that the world is making a policy mistake. We're now moving into the territory and trying to produce growth out of nowhere, but we are in fact shifting that growth from each other rather than creating growth. And of course, there is a past history of doing this during the Great Depression, where we've got into competitive devaluation. And he's talking there about the central bank's currency war, which you might have heard about in the news, where different developed economies are trying to reduce their interest rates to try and increase the value of their own currency. Well, what are the problems? Well, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, recently provided the world with a list of problems. It said, we have dollar debt, rising volatility, deflation and bad loans, we're seeing an oil price plummet, market bubbles, geopolitical risks, China real estate, and an interest rate rise. We don't have time to go into all of them now tonight, but if you do have spare time yourself, I'm sure you'll be amazed at, as you look further into it, as to the kind of situation that we have in front of us. And so I've got a short clip here which I'll play.
We're in this critical state, getting close to the supercritical state where the system implodes. But it takes a catalyst, it takes a flashpoint. One of the key flashpoints we're looking at is foreign ownership of U.S. government debt. Now, this is a very important thing to understand. We all know that the Treasury has issued over $17 trillion worth of debt. The question is, who buys it? A lot of U.S. debt is owned by foreigners. Who owns it? China, Russia, other countries that are not necessarily our friends, but they can dump it when they want to. Well, guess what? That's actually what's been going on. Recently, foreign holdings of U.S. government debt have been plummeting. But it gets even more interesting than that. We talked earlier about the project I did for the CIA, Project Prophecy, and we said you can see not only market action, but rivals, enemies, terrorists, and others operating in financial markets. So we all know that Russia invaded Crimea in the spring of 2014, and Crimea is now effectively part of Russia. So let's say you're Putin. You know you're going to invade Crimea. You know you want to take over eastern Ukraine. You can expect U.S. financial sanctions. So what do? You basically mitigate the impact of the sanctions. Start dumping treasuries in advance so that when you make your move, and the Treasury tries to come against you, you've insulated yourself. So now you go back and look at October, here's Russia dumping treasuries month after month. That was a clear signal that they were getting ready to do something to engage in financial warfare against the United States. Guess what? It's worse than that. We know the Russians and Chinese are working together. So is it any surprise that when the Russians started dumping, the Chinese started dumping also? So if the Russians are dumping, the Chinese are dumping, and the Fed's tapped out, who's going to buy all this debt? Well, a mystery buyer has shown up. Recently, Belgium has bought enormous amounts, in the hundreds of billions of dollars of U.S. government securities.
So Belgium started loading up on treasuries, coincidentally, at the exact same time Russia and China began dumping theirs.
It's not the Belgians. These amounts are bigger than the Belgian current account surplus. These are not Belgian dentists who are buying these things. Belgium is a front. Could it be the Fed itself? That's the point. Maybe the public doesn't know who the mystery buyer is, but the national security community does. Now, the Treasury, operating through this war room, and the Fed mystery buyer in Belgium, for now, have managed to prop up the Treasury market. It hasn't collapsed yet, but they're not going to be able to keep pulling these rabbits out of a hat. There's a limit. This should be very scary because if the Fed's tapped out, we talked earlier about how the Fed's leveraged 77 to 1. So the Fed's at the limit of what they can do. The foreigners are now dumping treasuries. And if no one buys it, guess what? Interest rates go up. That'll sink the stock market. That'll sink the housing market. Higher interest rates mean the debt gets higher. So interest rates go up some more. So you start a death spiral and there's no way out of it. But we're now engaged in financial warfare. Russia's ready to fight back. And this is not, classified information. This is being said publicly. Andrei Kostin, president and chairman of Russian Vnestorg Bank, VTB Bank, it's one of the largest banks in Russia, he recently said, it's time to change the entire international financial system that considers the dollar the key reserve currency. The world has changed. There's another member of the Russian parliament. He said, the dollar is evil. We will sell rubles to consumers of our oil and gas, and later we'll exchange the rubles for gold. If they don't like this, let them not do it. Let them freeze to death. We're talking about a prolonged depression. We're talking about massive deflation, massive unemployment, rampant bank collapses, a 70% best case scenario stock market drop. This could all start within the next 6 months. Look at it this way. Americans right now are standing at the very bottom of a tall mountain, Mount Everest, Mount Kilimanjaro. About halfway up the mountain, there's a catastrophic avalanche barreling down towards us.
And so Rick Hartz has identified a range of issues which sound very similar to what the International Monetary Foundation identified, and he goes through them in a bit more detail in the rest of that video. Okay, and so, well, that's pretty amazing stuff. It's not far off, and apparently all it needs is a trigger before the system will implode. Well, there is a potential trigger that investors are worried about, and it's coming up in September. And it's only not only investors and bankers who are worried about this, but it's the International Monetary Foundation and the World Bank who have both issued statements. CNN Money said that the World Bank and the IMF are urging the Federal Reserve not to raise rates until 2016 because the US economy isn't strong enough yet. They're talking about interest rates. And so there's a picture here which depicts the Federal Reserve as a truck and a snail, which is apparently US economic recovery. And I'm sure that if they try and jumpstart it, the snail's head will probably fall on the truck and squash it, which is probably what they're trying to get, the point they're trying to get across. And figuratively speaking, it is possible for the Federal Reserve to bring about its own demise if it does lift interest rates. And so there they are. So you've got the US Federal Reserve, which is managed by the Governor Janet Yellen, and the International Monetary Foundation Director, who is Christine Lagarde. And they've both been disagreeing over when this should happen, because it hasn't happened for about almost 10 years. When this does happen, historically, there's been problems in economies. And so you say, well, how bad could this be? It's just an interest rate rise. Well, we've also seen here that it's not just the IMF and the World Bank who are worried about this. This article here was written by the Wall Street Journal, and it says, talk to any banker, investor or hedge fund manager today. One topic will dominate the conversation, and it isn't Greece. The fear is that a Fed rate increase could unleash such disruptions on a grand scale. And so we're just waiting for a trigger. And the question for the world is what is this trigger and when? But we know that there will be a trigger at some point in God's good time. We just need to be ready when that does happen. And so it is that that's a bit hard to see, sorry. In Luke 17, our Lord says that in the time of Noah, there was a time of general prosperity until the day that Noah entered the ark. And he says that in the time of Sodom, there was a time of general prosperity until Lot went out of Sodom. And he says on the day when the Son of Man is revealed, that is our Lord Jesus Christ, there will be a time of general prosperity, but on the day when he is revealed, that prosperity will cease to exist. And he goes on in Luke chapter 21 and it says, But watch yourselves, lest your hearts be weighed down with the cares of this life, and that day come upon you suddenly like a trap, for it will come upon all those who dwell upon the face of the whole earth. And so, brothers and sisters, the message for us could not be clearer. We read of the chapter of the time of Laodicea, the ecclesia of Laodicea, where Christ said to them, Because thou sayest, I am rich and increased with goods and have need of nothing, and knowest not that thou art wretched and miserable and poor and blind and naked, I counsel thee to buy of me gold tried in the fire, that thou mayest be rich, and white raiment, that thou mayest be clothed, that the shame of thy nakedness do not appear, and anoint thine eye with eye salve, that thou mayest see. As many as I love, I rebuke and chasten. Be zealous, therefore, and repent. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. And when we read of the time of the Laodiceans, we find that they were living a life of general indulgence. They were enjoying what they might have called the easy life, the middle class and the upper class, and largely speaking, they had what they wanted. But spiritually they lacked, and they were in deep trouble because of it. And the message is the same for us, for the Latter-day Ecclesia. Let's forget about the appearance of success. Forget about indulgence. Forget about luxury. Forget about the grass that is greener on the other side, because very soon we will be taken to judgment, and none of that will matter. Well, as we close tonight, I've got some food for thought. Some time ago, I visited a sister's house, and when I walked into her kitchen, I noticed that she had an open letter on her fridge. I couldn't help but read it and since then it has left a big impression on me. The letter you'll see here isn't the same as the one that she's written, but it is very similar. And so after we've closed in prayer, I'll open this letter up as a form of meditation. You don't have to read it, but if you do want to, I'll leave it up on the screen there, and you're welcome to read it. And if you like it, I encourage you all to follow the example of that sister and write your own letter.